Chapter 33 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 33. A Mother to be Proud of. Old people tell of certain years when typhus fever swept over the country like a pestilence. Years that bring back the remembrance of deep sorrow, refusing to be comforted, to many a household, and which those whose beloved passed through the fiery time unscathed, shrink from recalling, for great and tremulous was the anxiety, miserable the constant watching for evil symptoms, and beyond the threshold of home a dense cloud of depression hung over society at large. It seemed as if the alarm was proportionate to the previous light-heartedness of fancied security, and indeed it was so. For since the days of King Belshazzar, the solemn decrees of doom have ever seemed most terrible, when they awe into silence the merry revellers of life. So it was this year to which I come in progress of my story. The summer had been unusually gorgeous. Some had complained of the steaming heat, but others had pointed to the lush vegetation, which was profuse and luxuriant. The early autumn was wet and cold, but people did not regard it, in contemplation of some proud rejoicing of the nation, which filled every newspaper and gave food to every tongue. In Eccleston these rejoicings were greater than in most places, for, by the national triumph of arms, it was supposed that a new market for the staple manufacture of the place would be opened, and so the trade, which had for a year or two been languishing, would now revive with redoubled vigour. Besides these legitimate causes of good spirits, there was the rank excitement of a coming election, in consequence of Mr Donne having accepted a government office, procured for him by one of his influential relations. This time the Cranworths roused themselves from their magnificent torpor of security in good season, and were going through a series of pompous and ponderous hospitalities, in order to bring back the Eccleston voters to their allegiance. While the town was full of these subjects by turns, now thinking and speaking of the great revival of trade, now of the chances of the election, as yet some weeks distant, now of the balls at Cranworth Court, in which Mr Cranworth had danced with all the belles of the shopocracy of Eccleston, there came creeping, in hidden slimy courses, the terrible fever, that fever which is never utterly banished from the sad haunts of vice and misery, but lives in such darkness, like a wild beast in the recesses of his den. It had begun in the low Irish lodging-houses, but there it was so common it excited little attention. The poor creatures died almost without the attendance of the unwarned medical men, who received their first notice of the spreading plague from the Roman Catholic priests. Before the medical men of Eccleston had time to meet together and consult, and compare the knowledge of the fever which they had severally gained, it had, like the blaze of a fire which had long smouldered, burst forth in many places at once, not merely among the loose living and vicious, but among the decently poor, nay, even among the well-to-do and respectable. And, to add to the horror, like all similar pestilences, its course was most rapid at first, and was fatal in the great majority of cases, hopeless from the beginning. There was a cry, and then a deep silence, and then rose the long wail of the survivors. A portion of the infirmary of the town was added to that already set apart for a fever ward. The smitten were carried thither at once, whenever it was possible, in order to prevent the spread of infection, and on that laser house was concentrated all the medical skill and force of the place. But when one of the physicians had died in consequence of his attendance, when the customary staff of matrons and nurses had been swept off in 2 days, and the nurses belonging to the infirmary had shrunk from being drafted into the pestilential fever ward, when high wages had failed to tempt any to what, in their panic, they considered as certain death, when the doctors stood aghast at the swift mortality among the untended sufferers, who were dependent only on the care of the most ignorant hirelings, too brutal to recognise the solemnity of death. All this had happened within a week from the first acknowledgment of the presence of the plague. Ruth came one day, with a quieter step than usual, into Mr Benson's study, and told him she wanted to speak to him for a few minutes. "To be sure, my dear, sit down," said he, for she was standing and leaning her head against the chimney piece, idly gazing into the fire. She went on standing there, as if she had not heard his words, and it was a few moments before she began to speak. Then she said: "I want to tell you that I have been this morning, and offered myself as matron to the fever ward while it is so full. They have accepted me, and I am going this evening." "Oh, Ruth, I feared this. I saw your look this morning as we spoke of this terrible illness." "Why do you say fear, Mr Benson? You yourself have been with John Harrison, and old Betty, and many others, I dare say, of whom we have not heard." "But this is so different, in such poisoned air, among such malignant cases. Have you thought and waited enough, Ruth?" She was quite still for a moment, but her eyes grew full of tears. At last she said, very softly, with a kind of still solemnity: "Yes, I have thought, and I have weighed; but through the very midst of all my fears and thoughts, I have felt that I must go." The remembrance of Leonard was present in both their minds, but for a few moments longer they neither of them spoke. Then Ruth said: "I believe I have no fear. That is a great preservative, they say. At any rate, if I have a little natural shrinking, it is quite gone when I remember that I am in God's hands. Oh, Mr Benson," continued she, breaking out into the irrepressible tears, "Leonard, Leonard!" And now it was his turn to speak out the brave words of faith. "Poor, poor mother!" said he. "But be of good heart. He too is in God's hands. Think what a flash of time only will separate you from him, if you should die in this work." But he, it will belong to him, Mr Benson. He will be alone." "No, Ruth, he will not. God and all good men will watch over him. But if you cannot still this agony of fear as to what will become of him, you ought not to go. Such tremulous passion will predispose you to take the fever." "I will not be afraid," she replied, lifting up her face, over which a bright light shone, as of God's radiance. "I am not afraid for myself. I will not be so for my darling." After a little pause, they began to arrange the manner of her going, and to speak about the length of time that she might be absent on her temporary duties. In talking of her return, they assumed it to be certain, although the exact time when was to them unknown, and would be dependent entirely on the duration of the fever. But not the less, in their secret hearts, did they feel where alone the issue lay. Ruth was to communicate with Leonard and Miss Faith through Mr Benson alone, who insisted on his determination to go every evening to the hospital to learn the proceedings of the day, and the state of Ruth's health. "It is not alone on your account, my dear. There may be many sick people of whom, if I can give no other comfort, I can take intelligence to their friends." All was settled with grave composure, yet still Ruth lingered, as if nerving herself up for some effort. At length she said, with a faint